Welcome to Shadow Frames, where we uncover the stories hidden in the shadows of time. Today we delve into a peculiar tale that begins with a wedding photograph from 1910, a picture that seemed perfectly ordinary until someone noticed something unusual about the groom's hand. 6 fingers. A small detail that would unravel a century of secrets. The photograph was discovered in the attic of the old Blackwood estate, tucked away in a weathered, leather-bound album. The mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the small town of Milfield, had remained unoccupied for decades until recently, when Thomas Harrington, a history professor from Boston University, inherited the property from a distant relative he barely knew existed. Thomas wasn't particularly thrilled about receiving the dilapidated estate. At 42, he was comfortably settled in his academic life, surrounded by books and research papers rather than the responsibilities of property ownership. Nevertheless, curiosity drove him to visit Milfield and inspect his inheritance before deciding whether to sell it. Milfield was one of those quintessential New England towns that seemed frozen in time. As Thomas's automobile rumbled down the cobblestone main street that autumn morning in 1976, he couldn't help but notice how the town appeared to have changed little since the early part of the century. Quaint storefronts with hand-painted signs, a town square dominated by a white wooden church, and locals who paused to observe the unfamiliar vehicle passing through their domain. The Blackwood estate sat 3 miles outside of town, at the end of a winding road flanked by ancient oak trees, whose branches formed a natural canopy overhead. The house itself was an imposing Victorian structure, 3 stories of faded grandeur with a widow's walk, peeling paint, and ivy claiming significant portions of the exterior walls. Quite the fixer-upper, Thomas muttered to himself as he parked and approached the iron gate that protected the property. The key he had received from the attorney was heavy and ornate, turning in the lock with reluctance, as if the estate itself was hesitant to admit this stranger. The interior of the mansion matched Thomas's expectations: dusty furniture draped in sheets, faded wallpaper, creaking floorboards, and the distinct smell of abandonment. It would take weeks just to properly inspect every room, he realized with a sigh. For 3 days, Thomas methodically explored the house, making notes about necessary repairs and photographing items of potential value. It was on the 4th day that he ventured into the attic, a space accessed through a narrow staircase hidden behind a door in the 3rd-floor corridor. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten history, trunks filled with clothing from bygone eras, furniture that had fallen out of fashion, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and several boxes of photographs. It was among these photographs that Thomas found the album. The leather cover was cracked with age, but the gold embossing still clearly read, "Blackwood Family Memories." Inside were dozens of photographs, carefully arranged in chronological order, starting from the 1880s. Each image was labeled with neat handwriting, identifying dates and individuals. Thomas flipped through the pages with growing interest. These were his ancestors, people whose blood ran in his veins, yet they were complete strangers to him. His father had never spoken much about the family history, and now Thomas understood why he had been so surprised by the inheritance. Somewhere along the line, their branch of the family had severed ties with the Blackwood name, and then he saw it, a wedding photograph dated June 18, 1910. The bride was identified as Elizabeth Catherine Blackwood, while the groom was labeled simply as Jonathan. The couple stood stiffly in their formal attire, surrounded by family members with solemn expressions, typical for photographs of that era when subjects had to remain still for extended periods. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual about the image. The bride was beautiful in an elaborate white dress with a high collar and delicate lace detailing. The groom was handsome in a formal black suit, his hair neatly parted to the side. The wedding party consisted of 8 additional people, presumably close family members. Thomas was about to turn the page when something caught his eye. He reached for the magnifying glass he had brought to examine smaller details in the house and held it over the photograph, focusing on the groom's right hand, which rested on a decorative pedestal beside him. 6 fingers, clear as day. The groom had 6 fingers on his right hand. "That's unusual," Thomas whispered, leaning closer. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra digits, wasn't extraordinarily rare, but something about seeing it in this formal, historic context felt strangely unsettling. The groom didn't appear to be hiding the anomaly. If anything, the positioning of his hand seemed to display it prominently. Thomas quickly scanned the other faces in the photograph. The bride's expression was difficult to read, somewhere between contentment and resignation. The family members ranged from proudly beaming to notably uncomfortable. One older woman, standing slightly apart from the group, had a distinct look of disapproval. Turning the photograph over, Thomas found additional writing. The union of our Elizabeth with Jonathan Thorne of Ravens Hollow. Ravens Hollow. The name sent an inexplicable chill down Thomas's spine. He had never heard of such a place, but it sounded ominous even without context. Was it nearby? Perhaps a neighboring town that had since changed its name or been absorbed by another municipality. Thomas carefully removed the photograph from the album and set it aside. He would need to research this branch of the family, particularly this mysterious six-fingered Jonathan Thorne. Something about the image nagged at him, like a splinter in his mind that refused to be ignored. As dusk approached, Thomas decided to return to his accommodations in town, a small room above the local tavern called the Wayfarer's Rest. He had intended to stay at the estate, but the lack of functioning utilities and the general disrepair made that impractical. Besides, the locals at the tavern might have information about the Blackwood family history. The Wayfarer's Rest was moderately busy that evening, with a mixture of locals and the occasional traveler passing through Milfield. Thomas took a seat at the bar and ordered a whiskey, placing the wedding photograph on the countertop before him. "Interesting picture you've got there," remarked the bartender, a robust man in his 60s with a full beard and knowing eyes. His name was Harold, and he had been friendly enough during Thomas's brief stay. "Founded at the Blackwood estate," Thomas replied. "I'm trying to learn more about my family history." Harold's hand paused momentarily as he was wiping a glass. "Blackwood, you say? You're related to that family?" "Apparently so. Distant enough that I never knew them, but close enough that I inherited the property." The bartender let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of history you've stepped into, Professor. The Blackwoods were influential in these parts." "Were they?" Thomas took a sip of his whiskey. "In what way?" Harold seemed to choose his words carefully. "Old money. Came from shipping, I believe. They kept to themselves mostly, especially in later years. The house has been empty since the last Blackwood, Margaret, I think her name was, passed away in the early 60s. Thomas nodded, then carefully turned the photograph toward Harold. "Do you recognize any of these people, particularly the couple getting married? Elizabeth Blackwood and Jonathan Thorne, from a place called Ravens Hollow." The bartender leaned forward, squinting at the image. His expression remained neutral until his eyes fell on the groom, specifically the man's hand. Harold straightened abruptly, his face draining of color. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice noticeably colder. "Like I said, in a family album at the estate." "Why? Do you recognize them?" Harold wiped his hands on his apron. "We don't talk about Ravens Hollow in Milfield, Professor, and we certainly don't discuss the Thornes." The sudden change in Harold's demeanor was striking. Thomas tried a different approach. "Is Ravens Hollow nearby? I'm not familiar with the area." "It was about 20 miles north of here," Harold replied reluctantly. "Nothing there now but ruins and bad memories. Fire took most of it in the winter of 1918. Those who survived scattered to the winds." "A fire?" Thomas pressed. "Some say it was an accident. Others claim it was deliberate." Harold retrieved the photograph and handed it back to Thomas, careful not to touch the image itself. "My advice to you, Professor, is to leave the past buried. Sell the estate if you want, but don't go digging into Blackwood business. No good will come of it." Before Thomas could respond, Harold moved away to serve another customer, effectively ending the conversation. Thomas remained at the bar, studying the photograph and reflecting on the bartender's strange reaction. The six-fingered hand seemed to mock him from the past, a silent challenge to uncover its secrets. Later that night, as Thomas prepared for bed in his small rented room, he placed the photograph on the nightstand. The faces of the wedding party stared back at him, frozen in time. Outside, a storm was brewing, rain pattering against the window as the wind picked up. Sleep came fitfully, and with it, dreams. In his dream, Thomas found himself at a wedding. The setting was vaguely familiar, the grounds of the Blackwood estate, but in its prime. Ladies in elegant Edwardian dresses and gentlemen in formal attire mingled on the manicured lawn. A string quartet played softly in the background. Thomas moved through the crowd, unnoticed by the guests. He approached the center of the gathering, where the newlywed couple was accepting congratulations. The bride, Elizabeth from the photograph, looked even more beautiful in person, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And then there was Jonathan, tall and imposing, turning to face Thomas directly, the six-fingered hand extended toward him. "Welcome to the family," Jonathan said, his voice surprisingly melodious, yet undercut with something predatory. His eyes were unusual, amber in color, with vertical pupils like a cat's. Thomas jerked awake, his heart racing. The storm outside had intensified, lightning illuminating the room in brief, harsh flashes. He reached for the photograph on the nightstand, but it wasn't there. Frantically, he searched the floor, thinking it might have blown off in the draft from the window. There, it had fallen face down beside the bed. Thomas retrieved it, turning it over. In the next flash of lightning, he gasped. The photograph had changed. The wedding party remained in their positions, but now they were all looking directly at the camera, including Jonathan, whose face was split in an unnatural grin. And his hand, the 6 fingers seemed elongated, almost claw-like. Thomas dropped the photograph as if it had burned him. When he gathered his courage and picked it up again, it appeared normal once more. He rubbed his eyes. "Just tired," he murmured. "Playing tricks on myself." The next morning, Thomas skipped breakfast and drove straight to the Milfield Historical Society, housed in a small building adjacent to the town library. If anyone could provide information about Ravens Hollow and the mysterious Thorne family, it would be there. The Historical Society was overseen by Meredith Winters, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose. She greeted Thomas with professional courtesy, her interest piquing when he mentioned his connection to the Blackwood family. "We have quite a bit of material on the Blackwoods," she informed him. They were instrumental in the development of Milfield throughout the 19th century. However, their influence waned considerably after the Great War. Thomas decided to be direct. "I'm particularly interested in a marriage that took place in 1910 between Elizabeth Blackwood and a man named Jonathan Thorne from Ravens Hollow." Meredith's reaction was subtle but noticeable, a slight stiffening of her posture, a momentary pause before responding. "That's a very specific inquiry, Mr. Harrington. May I ask why you're interested in this particular union?" Thomas showed her the photograph. "I found this at the estate. The groom has 6 fingers, which caught my attention, and when I mentioned Ravens Hollow to the bartender at the Wayfarer's Rest, he seemed disturbed." Meredith examined the photograph with a historian's careful eye. Polydactyly was often considered a mark of either divine blessing or demonic influence in earlier times. She said matter-of-factly, "As for Ravens Hollow, it has a troubled history. The settlement was founded in the late 1700s by a group seeking religious autonomy. They practiced what some might call unorthodox beliefs." "What kind of beliefs?" Thomas asked. Meredith adjusted her glasses. "They worshipped nature, but with a particularly dark interpretation. They believed in old gods, entities that resided in the forests and demanded tribute. Their practices became increasingly concerning to neighboring communities, including Milfield and the Thornes. The Thornes were the leading family of Ravens Hollow, effectively its founders and rulers." Meredith walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder. "We have limited documentation, but what we do have suggests they maintained their authority through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and claims of special connection to these entities they worshipped." She placed a brittle newspaper on the table between them, dated December 3, 1918. The headline read, "Tragedy at Ravens Hollow. Fire destroys isolated settlement." The official report states that an unattended hearth fire spread during a winter storm, Meredith explained. But there were rumors that the fire was intentionally set by people from surrounding communities who had grown fearful of Ravens Hollow practices. Thomas scanned the article. The death toll was estimated at 78 souls, nearly the entire population. Only a handful of residents were confirmed to have escaped the inferno. No Thornes were listed among the survivors. "And what about Elizabeth Blackwood?" Thomas asked. "What happened to her after she married into the Thorne family?" Meredith hesitated. Records indicate she returned to the Blackwood estate in the summer of 1915 without her husband. She was changed, according to accounts, withdrawn. She rarely left the property and refused all visitors except immediate family. "Did she have any children with Jonathan Thorne?" "There is mention of a child, yes. A daughter named Lillian, born in 1912. Meredith pulled another document from the folder. This is from the Milfield Gazette's Society column announcing the birth. It notes that mother and child are in good health, though the infant displays the distinctive Thorne trait of an additional digit, 6 fingers. The trait had been passed down. "What happened to Lillian?" Thomas asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "That's where the record becomes unclear," Meredith admitted. There's no death certificate, but she disappears from documentation after 1918. Given the timing, it's possible she was visiting Raven's Hollow during the fire. Thomas rubbed his temples, trying to process this information. And Elizabeth, what became of her? She lived at the Blackwood estate until her death in 1957. By all accounts, she became increasingly reclusive and eccentric. The locals referred to her as the Widow Blackwood. She reverted to her maiden name after returning from Raven's Hollow. Something wasn't adding up. If Elizabeth died in 1957, and the last Blackwood died in the early 60s, as I was told, who was this Margaret that the bartender mentioned? Meredith's expression clouded. Margaret Blackwood was Elizabeth's younger sister. She inherited the estate after Elizabeth's passing and lived there until her death in 1963. She was the last of the direct Blackwood line in Milfield. Thomas pulled out his notebook and jotted down these details. Is there anything about why Elizabeth left Raven's Hollow and her husband, or why she came back without him? Meredith closed the folder with a certain finality. Mr. Harrington, what I'm about to share isn't documented in our official records. It's more local knowledge, passed down through generations in Milfield. She lowered her voice, though they were alone in the room. It's said that Elizabeth fled Raven's Hollow in the dead of night, fearing for her life and the life of her daughter. According to the stories, Jonathan Thorne wasn't entirely human. The six fingers were just the most visible sign of something much more troubling. Not human? Thomas repeated incredulously. What does that even mean? The people of Raven's Hollow believed the Thornes had made a pact with what they called the Old Ones centuries ago, entities from the deep woods that granted them power, longevity, and influence in exchange for certain sacrifices. The six fingers were supposedly a mark of this covenant, a physical manifestation of their otherness. Thomas wanted to dismiss this as superstitious nonsense, but the historian's serious demeanor gave him pause. The story goes that Elizabeth discovered the true nature of the bargain her husband's family had made and what they intended for her daughter. Lillian was to be offered as a bride to one of these entities when she came of age, continuing a tradition that had allegedly sustained the Thorne lineage for generations. That's... Thomas struggled to find words. Folklore, Meredith supplied diplomatically. The product of isolation, religious differences, and the human tendency to demonize the unfamiliar. Nevertheless, Elizabeth's fear was real enough that she fled with her child and sought sanctuary with her family. And Lillian, if she wasn't in the fire, local legend suggests that Jonathan Thorne came for his daughter in the summer of 1918. Whether he succeeded in taking her back to Raven's Hollow before the fire, no one knows for certain. Meredith removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. What is documented is that Elizabeth became completely withdrawn after that summer, speaking to no one except her sister Margaret. Thomas sat back, trying to make sense of what he'd learned. Part of him wanted to dismiss the supernatural elements as rural superstition. Yet there was something undeniably eerie about the six-fingered hand in the photograph and the reactions it provoked in the townspeople. I'd like to visit the site of Raven's Hollow, he decided aloud. Meredith's expression grew concerned. I wouldn't advise that, Mr. Harrington. The area is largely unmarked now, overgrown and difficult to access. Some of the land was absorbed into the state forest preserve, while other sections became private property. Nevertheless, Thomas insisted, if I'm to understand my family's connection to this place, I should see it for myself. Reluctantly, Meredith marked the location on a map for him. The old road is long gone, but there's a Forest Service trail that passes near where the settlement once stood. Just be careful. The terrain is treacherous, and there are still those who believe the area is somehow tainted by what happened there. Thomas thanked her for her assistance and left with the map and a small stack of photocopied documents. The rational, academic part of his mind classified the tales of inhuman thorns and forest entities as classic examples of rural mythology, the kind that developed around isolated communities with different religious practices. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than superstition. Back at the Blackwood estate, Thomas returned to the attic to search for more information about Elizabeth and Lillian. He spent hours sifting through boxes of correspondence, financial records, and personal effects, piecing together the family's history. A breakthrough came in the form of a small diary bound in faded green leather, tucked inside a music box. The flyleaf identified it as belonging to Margaret Blackwood, Elizabeth's sister. The entries began in 1914 and continued sporadically until 1920. Thomas sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, carefully turning the brittle pages, reading by the light of a battery-powered lamp as daylight faded outside. Margaret's elegant handwriting detailed her concerns about Elizabeth's marriage from the beginning. April 14, 1914. Elizabeth visited today, the first time since Christmas. She seems diminished somehow, her spirit dampened. When I inquired about Jonathan, she changed the subject. The child Lillian is peculiar, unnaturally quiet for a 2-year-old, with those unusual amber eyes so like her father's. And of course the 6 fingers, just like all the Thornes. I cannot help but wonder if father was right to oppose the match so vehemently. Later entries grew increasingly alarming. June 22, 1915, Elizabeth arrived on our doorstep in the dead of night, clutching Lillian to her breast, both of them soaked from the rain. She was nearly incoherent with fear, babbling about what they really are and what they want with Lily. Father has given them sanctuary and instructed the staff that no visitors are to be admitted without his explicit approval. I have never seen my sister so terrified. August 9, 1915. Elizabeth finally shared some of what she witnessed at Raven's Hollow. I daren't commit the details to paper for fear they might be true. If even half of what she claims about the Thorne family and their practices is accurate, then she was right to flee. I find myself checking the locks twice each night and starting at every unusual sound in the gardens. December 1, 1915. Father passed away suddenly this morning. The physician claims it was his heart, but Elizabeth is convinced it was Jonathan's doing. He doesn't need to be physically present to influence events, she told me, her eyes wild. That's what they can do, reach out from a distance, especially to those who've been marked. She examined Father's body herself, searching for what she called the sign. I fear for her sanity. The diary entries became less frequent after their father's death, focusing primarily on the challenges of maintaining the estate and Elizabeth's increasing paranoia. She reportedly transformed her bedroom into a kind of fortress, with religious symbols from multiple faiths adorning the walls and doorways. Then came the entry that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. July 18th, 1918, the most terrible night. I was awakened by Lillian's screams, only to find Elizabeth struggling with a tall figure in the child's bedroom. The intruder moved with inhuman swiftness, but I caught a glimpse of his face in the moonlight. Jonathan Thorne, unchanged since the wedding, despite the passage of 8 years. Elizabeth fought like one possessed, but he was too strong. He took Lillian and vanished into the night, not through the door or window, but seemingly through the very shadows themselves. Elizabeth is inconsolable. She keeps repeating, "The summer solstice is next year. We have until then. We have until then." The final entry related to the matter was dated November 30th, 1918. News reached us today of the fire at Raven's Hollow, the entire settlement consumed by flames during last week's blizzard. Elizabeth received the news with an odd mixture of relief and despair. "Is she free now?" she asked the messenger. "Is my Lily truly free? Or did they take her to the deep woods before the fire?" No one could answer her questions. "I pray the child perished quickly in the flames, for the alternative Elizabeth fears is too horrific to contemplate." Thomas closed the diary, his mind reeling. The academic in him still sought rational explanations. Perhaps Jonathan Thorne was merely a charismatic cult leader who had brainwashed his followers. The inhuman descriptions could be the product of Margaret's frightened imagination, or Elizabeth's psychological trauma. And yet, he returned to the wedding photograph, studying Jonathan Thorne's face more carefully. There was something distinctly predatory in the man's expression, a confidence bordering on arrogance. And those eyes, even in the sepia-toned image, they seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. Thomas made his decision. Tomorrow he would visit what remained of Raven's Hollow. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for a hike into the forest. Thomas dressed appropriately in sturdy boots and layers, packing a backpack with water, food, a first aid kit, and other essentials. He brought a camera to document anything of interest he might find, along with Meredith's map and a compass. The drive to the trailhead took about 40 minutes, the last portion on a gravel Forest Service road that tested his city car's suspension. The trail itself was marked with blue blazes, winding through old-growth forest that grew increasingly dense as he progressed. According to Meredith's map, Raven's Hollow had been situated in a natural clearing approximately 3 miles from where he'd parked. The trail wouldn't lead directly to it, but would pass within a half-mile of the former settlement's location. The forest was unusually quiet. No birdsong, No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of Thomas's footsteps on the leaf-strewn path and his own breathing. The trees themselves seemed to grow more twisted and ancient as he walked deeper, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns. 2 hours into his hike, Thomas noticed a change in the forest's character. The trees were blackened on one side, as if they had survived some great conflagration. These burn marks were old, the wood long since healed around the scars, but they provided clear evidence that he was approaching the right area. When he reached the point where he needed to leave the trail, Thomas tied a bright orange marker to a tree branch to help him find his way back. Then, compass in hand, he struck out into the trackless woods, heading northeast toward where Raven's Hollow had once stood. The going was difficult. Fallen logs, thick brambles, and uneven terrain slowed his progress. Yet there was something purposeful about the obstacles, as if the forest itself was reluctant to yield access to its secrets. Just as Thomas was considering turning back, the woods opened suddenly into a clearing. Not a natural one, but an area where the trees had been methodically removed long ago. Now, young saplings and undergrowth competed for space among the ruins of what had once been a community. Stone foundations were still visible in places, poking through the vegetation like the bones of some massive creature. The remnants of a well stood near what must have been the center of the settlement, and there, on slightly higher ground at the northern edge of the clearing, was a more substantial ruin, a building constructed of stone rather than the wood that had fed the devastating fire. Thomas approached this structure carefully, his instincts telling him it had been significant to the community, perhaps a meeting house or place of worship. The stone walls, though partially collapsed, still reached nearly 6 feet high in places. The interior was choked with vegetation, but Thomas could discern the remains of a circular design with what appeared to be an altar stone at its center. He took several photographs, documenting the ruins from different angles. As he circled the structure, he noticed symbols carved into some of the stones, not the Christian imagery he might have expected, but older, more primal designs, spirals, concentric circles, stylized trees, and what looked like elongated human figures with additional appendages. Thomas traced one such carving with his fingertips, a 6-fingered handprint pressed into the stone. The impression was deep, as if the rock had been soft when the mark was made. A chill ran down his spine despite the afternoon warmth. Moving to the center of the structure, Thomas examined the altar stone more closely. It was a slab of dark granite, incongruous with the local stone used for the walls. The surface was stained with dark patches that centuries of rain had failed to wash away completely. On the far side of the altar, partially hidden by encroaching ferns, was another stone, smaller, but made of the same dark granite. Thomas pushed aside the vegetation to reveal what appeared to be a grave marker. Unlike the cryptic symbols on the walls, this stone bore a name and dates carved in English. Lillian Elizabeth Thorne, born April 17, 1912. Ascended June 21, 1919. Ascended, Thomas murmured aloud. Not died or departed, or any of the usual euphemisms for death. And the date, June 21, 1919, was the summer solstice, exactly as Margaret's diary had mentioned. But that was months after the fire that supposedly destroyed Raven's Hollow. As Thomas straightened up, a movement at the edge of his vision caused him to turn sharply. Nothing was there, just shadows cast by the trees surrounding the clearing. Yet he could have sworn he'd seen a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, watching him from the tree line. The forest had grown preternaturally still. No wind, no insects buzzing, no birds calling. Just a heavy silence that seemed to press against Thomas's eardrums. He had the distinct feeling that he was being observed from all sides. "Hello?" he called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. His voice sounded wrong somehow, muffled as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. As if in response to his call, a soft whispering arose from the surrounding woods. Not words exactly, but a sibilant rhythmic sound that might have been language. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thomas's rational mind suggested wind in the leaves, but there was no wind. Every survival instinct he possessed urged him to leave immediately. He backed away from the altar stone, fumbling with his camera to take one final photograph. When he raised the viewfinder to his eye, his blood froze. There, standing on the far side of the altar stone, was a small figure in a white dress, a child of perhaps 7 years, with long dark hair and amber eyes with vertical pupils, 6 fingers on the tiny hand that reached toward him. Thomas dropped the camera, the tool clattering against the stone floor. When he looked up, the figure was gone, if it had ever been there at all. He didn't remember much about his frantic journey back through the forest. Branches whipped at his face, roots seemed to reach up to trip him, and the whispers followed, growing in volume and urgency. Somehow, he found the trail and ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to collapse beneath him. By the time Thomas reached his car, the sun was setting. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes, trying to calm his racing heart and make sense of what he'd experienced. Had he actually seen something in those ruins? Or had his mind been influenced by Margaret's diary and the wedding photograph? Was he allowing himself to be swept up in local superstitions? The drive back to Milfield was a blur. Thomas headed straight for the Wayfarer's Rest, desperately in need of a drink and human companionship to dispel the lingering sense of dread that had followed him from the forest. The tavern was busier than usual, filled with locals enjoying their Friday evening. Thomas claimed a stool at the bar, ordered a double whiskey and downed it quickly, signaling for another. Harold served him without comment, though his eyes narrowed at Thomas's disheveled appearance. "You went there, didn't you?" the bartender finally asked, keeping his voice low. "To what's left of Raven's Hollow." Thomas nodded, not bothering to deny it. "I found ruins and what looked like some kind of stone temple or meeting house." Harold's expression darkened. "The gathering place, they called it, where the Thornes conducted their rituals. There was a grave marker," Thomas continued, "for Lillian Thorne, dated 1919, but I thought the settlement burned in 1918. The bartender leaned closer. "The buildings burned, not all the people. Some say the fire was set to drive the Thornes out, force them into the open where they could be dealt with properly. Didn't work, though. The survivors just went deeper into the woods, continued their practices away from prying eyes." "What practices?" Thomas pressed. "Everyone hints at dark rituals, but no one will speak plainly." Harold glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "The Thornes believed they were descended from something ancient, something that dwelled in the deepest part of the forest before humans ever set foot in this land. Every generation, they'd strengthen this bloodline through a specific ritual on the summer solstice. They'd offer one of their own, always a female child with the 6 fingers, to these forest entities." "Offer how?" Thomas asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "Not the way you're thinking," Harold replied grimly. "The child wasn't killed. She was transformed. Prepared throughout her childhood, then on the appointed day, she would be brought to the gathering place and undergo what they called the ascension. After that, she wasn't human anymore. She became something in between, a bridge between worlds." Thomas thought of the grave marker with its strange wording. Ascended, not died. "The people of Raven's Hollow saw this as an honor," Harold continued. "The highest calling for a daughter of the Thorne bloodline. But Elizabeth Blackwood, being an outsider who married in, saw it for what it was, a barbaric sacrifice of a child. When she realized what they intended for her daughter, she fled. But according to what I read, Jonathan Thorne took Lillian back in 1918, Thomas said. Harold nodded solemnly. Brought her back to what remained of the community after the fire. They were living deeper in the forest by then, where no one could interfere with the ritual. The solstice of 1919 came and he made a vague gesture. No one knows exactly what happens during the ascension, but afterward, the child isn't seen again, at least not in a form recognizable as human. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. "You speak as if you believe all this." "Believe?" Harold gave a humorless laugh. "Professor, my grandfather was part of the group that set the fire in 1918. He saw things in Raven's Hollow that haunted him until his dying day. Things that made him nail 6-pointed stars above every door and window in his house. Things that made him teach his children and grandchildren never to enter the deep woods alone, especially not at dusk or dawn." The bartender refilled Thomas's glass without being asked. "The Thornes are gone now. At least the human parts of the family are. But the woods remember. And sometimes people who wander too close to the old gathering place report seeing a child in a white dress, watching from between the trees. A little girl with 6 fingers and eyes like a cat's." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't mentioned what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, in the ruins. "You saw her, didn't you?" Harold asked quietly. "Lillian still guards the threshold between worlds." That's what the ascension meant. Becoming a keeper of the gate, neither fully human nor fully whatever lies on the other side. "This is madness," Thomas muttered, though without conviction. "Folklore and superstition." "Maybe so," Harold conceded. But answer me this, Professor. Why do you think you inherited the Blackwood estate? You specifically, out of all the possible distant relatives? The question caught Thomas off guard. I assumed it was simply a matter of being the closest living kin, legally speaking. Harold shook his head slowly. The Blackwood line and the Thorne line, joined by marriage. Bloodlines matter in these old families. Have you looked at your own hands lately, Professor? Really looked at them? Thomas instinctively glanced down at his hands wrapped around the whiskey glass. 5 fingers on each. Perfectly normal. What are you implying? Nothing, Harold replied. Just suggesting that inheritance isn't always about property and money. Sometimes it's about something in the blood, something waiting to be awakened. The 6 fingers don't always appear in every generation, you know. Sometimes the trait lies dormant, only to re-emerge generations later. Thomas pushed away from the bar, suddenly needing fresh air. You're trying to frighten me with backwoods mythology. I'm a historian, Mr. Harold. I deal in documented facts, not campfire stories. Suit yourself, Professor, Harold called after him as he headed for the door. But if I were you, I'd be very careful about spending any more time in that house. The Blackwoods had their own secrets, ways of binding and containing things that shouldn't be loose in the world. With no one maintaining those protections for all these years, Thomas stepped out into the night air, grateful for its coolness against his flushed face. Harold's words had disturbed him more than he cared to admit, touching on fears that had been growing since he first saw the 6-fingered hand in the wedding photograph. He decided to return to the estate one last time to collect his notes and the photograph album, then check out of the Wayfarer's Rest in the morning. Boston and his orderly academic life suddenly seemed very appealing compared to Milfield and its unsettling history. The Blackwood mansion loomed against the night sky as Thomas drove through the gates. He hadn't left any lights on, yet he could have sworn he saw a movement behind one of the third-floor windows. A quick flicker like someone passing by with a candle. Just nerves, he told himself firmly, retrieving his flashlight from the glove compartment. The batteries were weaker than he remembered, casting a yellowish glow that barely illuminated the path to the front door. Inside, the house felt different somehow. The air was thick and still, yet Thomas had the distinct impression of activity just beyond the range of his senses, like stepping into a room where a conversation had abruptly ceased moments before. He moved quickly to the attic stairs, wanting to retrieve the photograph album and be done with this place. The staircase seemed longer than he remembered, the steps creaking rhythmically beneath his feet, as if keeping time with some unheard melody. The attic door was ajar, though Thomas distinctly remembered closing it when he left. A faint, sweet scent wafted from within, like wildflowers and copper and something else he couldn't identify. His flashlight beam weakened further as he pushed the door open, revealing only a small circle of visibility in the vast, dark space. The album wasn't where he'd left it. Thomas moved cautiously between trunks and furniture, sweeping his faltering light across surfaces. There, on a small table near the dormer window, the album lay open, a single candle burning beside it. Thomas froze. He hadn't left a candle, and even if he had, it couldn't still be burning after so many hours. Someone was in the house with him. "Hello?" he called, his voice embarrassingly thin. "Is someone there?" The candle flame bent sideways, though there was no draft. In its wavering light, Thomas could see that the album was open to the wedding photograph, but it had changed again. Now the entire wedding party was blurred, as if they had moved during the exposure, except for Jonathan Thorne, who remained unnaturally clear, staring directly out of the image with an expression of malicious triumph. A floorboard creaked behind Thomas. He whirled around, the flashlight slipping from his suddenly numb fingers and clattering to the floor, where it flickered once and went out completely. In the dim candlelight, he could just make out a figure standing by the attic door, a tall, thin silhouette with unnaturally long fingers. "Who's there?" Thomas demanded, his voice breaking. "This is private property." A soft laugh answered him, melodious yet undercut with something predatory. "Is it? I rather think my claim predates yours, Professor Harrington. Blood calls to blood after all." The figure stepped forward into the pool of candlelight. It was a man, or had the shape of a man, dressed in an antiquated formal suit that might have been fashionable in 1910. His features were aristocratic, his hair dark and neatly parted, but his eyes were amber with vertical pupils, gleaming in the darkness like a cat's. "Jonathan Thorne," Thomas whispered, recognition and horror mingling in his gut. The figure inclined his head in acknowledgement. "In the flesh, so to speak. How kind of you to return to the family estate. We've been waiting for you, you know. Waiting for the bloodlines to converge once more." "This is impossible," Thomas said, backing away until he bumped against the table. "You'd be over 100 years old if you were even real." Jonathan smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Time moves differently for my kind, Professor, and real is such a limited concept. I am as real as the ground beneath your feet, as real as the fear coursing through your veins right now." He extended his right hand, displaying 6 long fingers. "You've been researching us, I understand, asking questions about Raven's Hollow, about the Ascension, about my dear daughter Lillian. So curious, so scholarly. Did you find what you were looking for in those ruins?" Thomas glanced desperately around for a weapon, anything to defend himself. "You can't be here. This is a delusion, a hallucination brought on by suggestion and stress." "Is it?" Jonathan moved with unnatural fluidity, suddenly much closer than he had been a moment before. "Then perhaps you're also hallucinating this." He reached out and touched Thomas's chest with one 6-fingered hand. A burning sensation spread from the point of contact, as if acid were eating through cloth and skin. Thomas cried out, staggering backward. "The mark of recognition," Jonathan explained calmly. "It identifies those of the bloodline who have potential. Your grandmother was Margaret Blackwood's daughter, yes? The child she bore after taking in her poor, traumatized sister and niece. Such a pity that Elizabeth discovered our plans for Lillian. She might have been welcomed into the family properly, might have understood the honor being bestowed upon her child." Thomas clutched at his chest where the burning sensation continued to spread. "My grandmother was Alice Harrington. Her maiden name was Stevens." Jonathan's smile widened. "A convenient fiction. Margaret Blackwood had a child out of wedlock in 1921. The father, well, let's say he was a visitor from the deep woods, drawn by the lingering presence of Lillian after her ascension. The child was given to a childless couple named Stevens, who raised her as their own and eventually saw her married to Robert Harrington, your grandfather." The room seemed to spin around Thomas as implications cascaded through his mind. If what Jonathan was saying was true, then Thomas himself was descended not just from the Blackwoods, but from whatever inhuman bloodline the Thornes had cultivated for generations. "You're lying," Thomas gasped, though a terrible certainty was growing within him. It would explain the inheritance, the strange pull he had felt toward the wedding photograph, the visions in the ruins. "Look at your hand, Professor," Jonathan said softly. Thomas raised his trembling right hand. At first it appeared normal, 5 fingers, just as it had always been. But as he watched in horror, the skin between his pinky and ring finger began to ripple and bulge, as if something was pushing its way to the surface. "No," Thomas moaned, clutching his wrist with his other hand as if he could stop what was happening. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." "The bloodline always tells," Jonathan continued relentlessly. "In times of great change or stress, the true nature emerges. Your scholarly curiosity led you back to us, back to your true family. And now, the gathering place awaits a new guardian. Lillian has served faithfully for over 60 years, but even those of our kind grow weary eventually. It's time for a replacement." Through a haze of pain and disbelief, Thomas suddenly understood. "You want me to ascend? To become like Lillian?" Jonathan shook his head. "Not you. Your child." "I don't have children," Thomas protested. "Not yet," Jonathan agreed. "But you will. The compulsion has already been planted in your mind. The drive to continue the bloodline, to find a suitable partner and produce offspring. You'll return to Boston, to your academic life, but you'll no longer be satisfied with scholarly pursuits alone. You'll seek companionship, marriage, children, and when your daughter is born, for it will be a daughter, she will bear the 6 fingers openly from birth." Thomas struggled to breathe as the pain in his hand intensified. The extra finger was more distinct now, pushing against the skin that still contained it, seeking release. "On her 7th birthday," Jonathan continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality, "you will bring her to the gathering place. You will feel drawn to return to Milfield, to the forest. You won't understand why, but you won't be able to resist. And there, among the ancient stones, Lillian will greet you both and begin the preparation for the next ascension." "I would never harm a child," Thomas protested. "I would never participate in some barbaric ritual." Jonathan laughed again, the sound echoing strangely in the attic space. "You speak as if you'll have a choice, Professor. The blood calls, And in the end, all who share our lineage answer. Elizabeth tried to defy it, tried to keep Lillian from her destiny. She failed, as you will fail if you resist. He moved closer still, his amber eyes filling Thomas's vision. But take heart. The ascension is not destruction, but transformation. Lillian has lived for decades beyond a human lifespan, will live for centuries more as the guardian of the threshold. Your daughter will join her, will become something far greater than mere humanity could offer. With a final excruciating tear, the sixth finger broke free of Thomas's flesh, fully formed and identical to its neighbors, as if it had always been there, merely hidden beneath the skin. Blood trickled down his wrist, each droplet seeming to sizzle as it struck the wooden floor. The pact is renewed, Jonathan intoned formally. The bloodline continues. When the time comes, you will bring the child to the gathering place. He stepped back, his form beginning to waver like heat distortion above summer pavement. Until then, live your life, Professor. Pursue your career, find a wife, start a family. Forget what happened here if you can. The conscious mind is remarkably adept at burying unwelcome truths. But on the appointed day, you will remember. The blood always remembers. Jonathan's figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Thomas alone in the attic with his transformed hand and the terrible knowledge of what awaited him and his future child in the years to come. Thomas fled the Blackwood estate that night, driving straight back to Boston without stopping, his six-fingered hand throbbing in time with his racing heart. He told himself it was all a hallucination, a vivid waking dream brought on by stress and suggestion. He almost convinced himself, wrapping his altered hand in a handkerchief and refusing to look at it as he drove. Back in the familiar surroundings of his faculty apartment, Thomas carefully unwrapped his hand, half expecting to find it normal, 5 fingers, as it had been his entire life. Instead, the 6th digit remained, fully formed and functional, indistinguishable from the others except for the red, inflamed skin around its base where it had emerged. In the months that followed, Thomas learned to hide his transformed hand. Winter gloves at first, then a specially made prosthetic that disguised the extra finger. He threw himself into his academic work, publishing papers and securing tenure, as if professional accomplishments could somehow counteract the darkness that had entered his life. Yet true to Jonathan's prediction, Thomas also found himself drawn to companionship in a way he never had before. He began dating a fellow professor named Claire, a brilliant linguist with warm eyes and an easy laugh. Their relationship progressed quickly, moving from colleagues to friends to lovers with an inevitability that should have alarmed Thomas but instead felt right, necessary. They married in the spring of 1978, a small ceremony attended by university colleagues. Thomas wore a specially designed glove that concealed his 6th finger. If Claire noticed anything unusual about his reluctance to remove it, even in private, she never pressed the issue, accepting it as one of her husband's eccentricities. When Claire announced her pregnancy in early 1979, Thomas experienced a complex mixture of joy and dread. He told himself that Jonathan's prophecy was nonsense, that the child might be a boy, or if a girl, would be perfectly normal. Yet deep in the recesses of his mind, a countdown had begun, a ticking clock measuring the years until a potential 7th birthday, when he would feel the inexorable pull back to Milfield, back to the ruins in the forest. Their daughter was born on October 31st, 1979. Samantha Eliza Harrington, 7 pounds, 8 ounces, with her mother's dark hair and her father's green eyes, and 6 perfect fingers on each hand. The doctors called it a harmless genetic anomaly. Claire was concerned primarily with whether it would affect Samantha's manual dexterity or subject her to teasing as she grew older. Only Thomas understood the true significance, the invisible mark of a bloodline stretching back through centuries of darkness. He was a devoted father, determined to create a normal, happy childhood for Samantha, despite the shadow hanging over her future. He read her stories, taught her to ride a bicycle, applauded at ballet recitals and school plays. He never once mentioned Raven's Hollow, or the Thornes, or the Gathering Place. Yet as Samantha's 7th birthday approached, Thomas began experiencing dreams, vivid nightmares in which he drove his daughter to the forest, led her by the hand to the stone ruins, and delivered her to a waiting figure in a white dress with amber cat's eyes. He would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, Claire slumbering peacefully beside him, unaware of the battle raging in her husband's soul. 3 months before Samantha's 7th birthday, Thomas made his decision. He would break the cycle, protect his daughter from whatever dark fate the Thorne bloodline had planned for her. There was only one way he could be certain: remove the possibility of returning to the gathering place. He filed for a sabbatical from the university, citing a research opportunity abroad that couldn't be passed up. Claire was surprised but supportive, especially when Thomas suggested that she and Samantha accompany him to Europe for the year-long project. They would be overseas when Samantha turned 7, thousands of miles from Milfield and its haunted forest. The plan was set, tickets purchased, arrangements made, their apartment sublet to a visiting scholar. 3 weeks before their departure, Thomas began to feel ill. A persistent headache, insomnia, a burning sensation in his 6-fingered hand that no amount of ice or medication could soothe. 1 week before they were scheduled to leave, Thomas woke in the middle of the night to find himself standing in Samantha's bedroom, looking down at his sleeping daughter. He had no memory of getting out of bed or walking down the hall. In his right hand, he held his car keys. Horrified, Thomas backed out of the room and locked himself in his study until morning. The compulsion was growing stronger, just as Jonathan had predicted. The blood was calling, and it would not be denied so easily. That day, Thomas made a desperate decision. He couldn't trust himself, couldn't risk becoming the instrument of his daughter's sacrifice. He wrote 2 letters, one to Claire explaining everything, though he knew she would likely believe him mentally ill rather than accept the supernatural truth, and one to Samantha, to be opened on her 18th birthday, warning her of her heritage and the danger that might still lurk in Milfield. The next day, Thomas Harrington disappeared. His car was found abandoned near the George Washington Bridge, leading authorities to conclude he had taken his own life, though his body was never recovered. Claire and Samantha mourned, eventually building a new life without him. The European trip was forgotten. The sabbatical canceled. Samantha grew into a beautiful, confident young woman with 6 fingers on each hand, a quirk she embraced rather than hid, even using it as her signature feature when she began a career as an artist. On her 18th birthday, she opened her father's letter as instructed and read his fantastic, disturbing account of the Blackwood Thorne lineage and the gathering place in the forest near Milfield. Most would have dismissed it as the delusions of a troubled mind, perhaps even the explanation for her father's apparent suicide. But Samantha had always sensed something different about herself, had experienced dreams of a stone ruin in a forest clearing and a girl in a white dress calling her sister. The letter didn't frighten her. It awakened something, answered questions she hadn't known how to ask. Now 25, Samantha Harrington packs her car for a road trip to New England. In her glove compartment lies a map with Milfield circled in red ink. In her dreams, Lillian still waits by the altar stone, patient after all these decades, ready to welcome another daughter of the bloodline home. And somewhere, watching from the shadows between worlds, Jonathan Thorne smiles his too wide smile. The blood has called again, as he knew it would, as it always does. The wedding photograph that started it all hangs now in a small gallery in New York, part of an exhibition of Samantha's artwork, exploring genetic anomalies and their historical significance. Visitors often comment on the eerily lifelike quality of the 6-fingered groom, how his eyes seem to follow them around the room, how he alone among the wedding party seems fully present, untouched by the passage of time. If you look closely at the photograph, you might notice something that wasn't there before. A shadowy figure at the far edge of the wedding party, indistinct except for a pair of green eyes and the outline of 6 fingers raised in greeting. Thomas Harrington found his way back to the family gathering after all, though not in the way Jonathan had planned. The blood always calls. The blood always remembers. And in a clearing in the deep woods outside Milfield, the gathering place stands ready for the next ascension.